is Billy Hulin. He's the head of sports science at the Collingwood Football Club. And our key topic of today's discussion will be about how to successfully link sports science research to practice, more specifically in elite sport. So if you're a high performance manager, sports scientist, strength and conditioning coach, or you're just interested in how elite sport works and functions, make sure to stick around. And if you've got any questions, you can feel free to hit the comment section below, and we'll try to get to your question at the end of the show. Before we start this episode, our mission here at Prepare Like a Pro is to empower aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. So if you like the show, please show support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Welcome, Billy. Thanks for jumping on, mate.
No worries, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to diving into our topic today. Yeah. I've had a few sports scientists on recently, and it's definitely a popular topic looking at the, no pun intended, looking at the data, the numbers, the listeners, it's definitely ranks highly. So no doubt this episode will do the same. But before we get into the meat of it all, do you mind just providing a quick background on everything you've done to date in terms of academic side of things, but also your experience in elite sport?
Yep. Yeah, sure. Obviously, as you mentioned, I'm at the Pies, but I've been here 3 months now, so I'm new to AFL. Spent the previous 9 years in rugby league, so this has been a good change of scenery for me, a new challenge in a new sport. So I had 2 years, the last 2 years prior to this, I've been at the South Sydney Rabbitohs in a sports science and a little bit of S&C role as well there, and then prior to that, I had 7 years at the Dragons. I guess my time at the Dragons started, I initially started there it was a master's scholarship in connection with the University of Wollongong. And that project was in and around training load monitoring in relation to injury risk. So I had, I guess, my first year there was probably one of the toughest years I've had in elite sport, where I was doing the master's full-time and I suppose working full-time embedded within the club, which was a great grounding for me. And then I moved into, I guess, strictly just a sports science role full time. But I had a bit of a passion for the research side of things. So I continued doing a PhD, but not the typical, I guess, embedded PhD scholarship at the club. I was full time at the club and did that PhD on the side, I guess, in my spare time, which was another good challenge. But I learned some great lessons along the way there. And then I guess over the next couple of years there, I moved a little bit into some coaching roles as well. So more so, I guess in your typical sports science role, you're collecting a lot of information and then relaying it to people on how you can, I guess, inform or drive your program. I was still doing that, but also doing some hands-on work in terms of coaching some players on the field and also interacting with coaches around planning training as well. And then prior to the Dragons, where I originally started, was I had a research scholarship with Cricket Australia, which was a similar question to the one I had at the Dragons. I guess I started in cricket, my time in cricket, at a really interesting time where 2020 had just been introduced to the schedule. So there's this real change in the schedule and the dynamic and the workloads that players were subjected to. And around about the time, I think it was about 11 years ago, 12 years ago maybe, a lot of fast bowlers started to break down. So there's this sort of mini injury crisis within the fast bowling group. So I had a research scholarship there looking at some training load data with around fast bowlers and injury risk, which is where that particular project's probably where I guess developed a real passion for applied sports science and research. So I guess that whole research process of being able to form a question and develop some insights that might be able to help coaches and players in practice. So I suppose just as a bit of a snapshot, I guess that's where my journey started and ended up with me here at the Pies now.
Yeah, fantastic, mate. And what about strong influences or mentors, if you like, throughout those different environments that you're in? Are there any that sort of help shape your philosophy today?
Yeah, definitely. There's been heaps. In the beginning, probably the biggest influences and mentors I had were Tim Gabbard and Peter Blanche. So the cricket project that I mentioned at the start, Peter Blanche was working at Cricket Australia at the time. and he obviously went on to roles at Essendon and the Brisbane Lions as well. But he reached out to Tim to have a little bit of help with some of the things that I mentioned before, and then Tim also got me on board. And those two were big mentors for me, really. I guess the knowledge, and not only the knowledge, but the way they went about things as people really, I guess I took a lot of learnings from them, and I wouldn't be where I am without those guys today. And I guess for Peter in particular, I mean, the time that I spent with Peter is probably a drop in the ocean compared to his whole career, but he had a really big influence on me in a short period of time. And then some other people, probably Rich Johnson's another one who was one of the influences, one of the supervisors on my PhD, and he had a big influence on me right from second year of undergrad, even up until today as well. But there's always, I think, a lot of people along the way that have had positive and negative, I guess, influences or learnings that they've provided me. I think it's really important to learn off both of those, and it's really great to sort of take little bits and pieces off all the people that you work with along the way and figure out what sort of works best for you.
Yep. And over a decade in elite sport, I imagine there'd be some pretty key highlights. Are there ones that spring front of mind? You're proud to experience?
Yeah, I think completing the postgrad degrees while I was working in sport are big highlights. But I think everyone's got sort of those stories of where they've made sacrifices and worked hard and got rewards at the end, and that's definitely one of them. I think right back to the beginning, it's one I mentioned a couple of times already, but the first experience I had in sport in cricket was probably one of the most rewarding ones I've had as well. Not just because it was new or the first experience that I had, but I sort of entered that environment where they had a really challenging period where there was a big change in the dynamic, and they had a big, I guess, problem not a big problem, but a problem that they wanted to answer in terms of injury rates with fast bowlers. And I felt like I was able to contribute to helping provide some insights around that problem. And that for me was really rewarding, and I was able to see them take that information and be able to use it in practice. So I think for me, that's probably one of the biggest, if not the main, highlights when I look back on my career so far. It'd be nice to be able to say that I had a premiership that I'd worked at a club when we won the premiership, and that was the biggest highlight. But maybe one day.
Yeah, definitely. And going back to that experience with Cricket Australia, were you working alongside a few other sports scientists? Was it more performance analysts, coaches? Like, what did sort of the team look like back then? Working closely with?
Yeah, sports science, I guess, in my time in cricket's definitely around more the biomechanics and performance analysis area. A bit different to maybe in team sports is a little bit more physiology based in some respects, I suppose. So there was Rian Crowther in that area that did a great job. I believe he's still there. And then Peter Blanche was head of sports science and sports medicine. But I think back in that day, in those days, full-time sports scientists weren't really a massive part of a lot of programs in team sports. I think it was really in those early days where they were maybe part-time or hired on a consultancy basis as needed. And that space was really developing. But definitely back then they had a good team of physiotherapists and S&C coaches that I worked in and around with. Yeah.
And at what point in your career did that start to shift where full-time roles start to pop up in the different codes?
Yeah, good question. I think, I first started at the Dragons at the end of 2013, and that was sort of, like I mentioned, an embedded research-based program with the Uni of Wollongong and the Dragons. So maybe I reckon a year or two after that, there started to become some full-time roles. I mean, I don't really think there are any part-time roles it's hard to have a part-time role within a program. You might be employed on a part-time basis, but it does consume a lot more time, I think, than you typically think it's going to. But yeah, I think around 2015, 2016 and thereabouts, as sort of the full-time sports scientist role started to become a bit more prevalent. Yeah.
And on the flip side, mate, challenges. Obviously, elite sport brings pressure and high expectations. What have been some significant challenges you've faced over your career, and what have you sort of learnt from it or grown from it as a practitioner?
Yeah, good question. I think sports science for me is about being able to provide information so that people can make informed decisions or provide evidence so that people can make informed decisions. Otherwise, programs are solely just based on opinion or previous experience. And that's not to say that opinion and previous experience aren't important, but sports science, I guess, is able to complement that with a little bit of evidence. I suppose the challenge with that is you have to be able to challenge other people's opinions and maybe challenge their beliefs a little bit, which I think for me, starting out early was one of the bigger challenges that it's not really part of your undergrad degree. You don't really learn how to talk to head coaches about maybe what you think's wrong with their program or things that could be done better. So I think that for me is always a constant evolving challenge, like being able to learn how different people want to receive feedback. Some people it's really easy to work with and they like to be challenged or like to be given information or feedback that they think could help develop and grow the program. And then other people might not necessarily like to hear that, or they might have a certain way that they want to hear feedback. So I think for me, that's one of the bigger challenges, which has been a fun experience to learn and grow in that space along the way. And then I guess another one's keeping up to date with all of the latest research as well. Like there's such an overwhelming amount of like massive research that's done within performance sport in a whole variety of different sports. So I think for me, it can be difficult to be able to keep up with that while you're also doing your day-to-day job within a club, particularly this time of year when we're in pre-season, which is usually the busiest part of the year, and you might be doing some long hours, and you know it can be very difficult to sort of keep up with that in that space. So I think one of the things I think helps in that regard is working in performance sport. We're generally like to be generalists rather than specialists. So to be able to have, I guess, a network of people that might specialize in certain areas that you can draw on and be able to keep you up to date with the latest knowledge and just be open-minded about trying to draw the opinions and experience and knowledge of others to help challenge you as well. In terms of challenges, I think, those are the main ones.
Yeah, thanks, mate, and thanks for the honesty as well in terms of insight of the challenges. Like the interpersonal skills, I think is an interesting one.
Yeah,
probably resonates with anyone that works in elite sport. Do you think that's something that can be embedded in undergraduate degrees or master's programs, or is it a matter of something you sort of have to be in that environment to experience it? Like, can you create it and develop it before that stage, or do you think it's a matter of experience?
I think experience is definitely the best way to learn it, but I definitely think it's be embedded in undergraduate programs. I think in my early days particularly that's why I found Tim Gavitt such a good mentor for me, was he really took a lot of time to get me experience talking and dealing with coaches. So he used to have practical days where lots of different coaches from different sports would come in and we'd have to talk to them and explain different projects and research that we were working on. And then they would in turn sort of challenge us, like, how is that useful? How is that going to help me? And those, I think, are things that I think some good mentors will be able to provide for their students, but I think they're things that can be, I think, developed and embedded in undergraduate programs a bit more. But also, you definitely need to be able to get out there and get some practical experience and be able to live and breathe it to develop really well in that space.
Yep. No, well said, mate. And moving over to the key topic in terms of how to successfully link sports science research to practice, you sort of touched on it before in terms of that objectivity and not just going off past experience, but having an objective lens. What else is the purpose of a sports scientist, do you think, in a team sport like AFL?
Well, I guess what you need, one of the first considerations when whether you want to apply new research or new processes within your program, I think it's always good to take a trip around the research process. So I think if you remember back to, anyone might have come across it in high school science, or if you in your undergraduate degree, but you can, even if you just look up the scientific method, you'll see there's a sort of this process where we start with a research question. We might look into what research or what we know about the topic area, develop a hypothesis, test with an experiment, analyze some data, and then I guess report those findings and then challenge ourselves with another question again. So I think it's important that you have a really solid purpose around what you want to do, or what sort of research questions or question you want to answer. So I suppose an example might be, we might want to develop, or we might want to implement some sleep monitoring, which is a really broad question, but we might want to dig a bit deeper. Like, what do we want to know? Do we want to know how our athletes wake up and how they feel in the morning, which we could potentially just ask them, or do we want to know how many hours they slept at night? Do we want to know what time they went to bed, what time they got up, or do we want to know even some more in-depth stuff like deep sleep, REM sleep, heart rate variability when at rest, and then also what sort of insights are we going to be able to take, and how are we going to use that in practice? What do we know already? How accurately and reliably can we measure all of those sorts of things? So I think you sort of have to start there. I think one of the pitfalls, or one of the hiccups in practice, is we come in a little bit later around the research process or the cycle, where we have all this data, and then we go back and we go, what sort of question can we answer with all of this data? And we probably don't develop the best findings, or the most robust studies, which I think is okay, as long as we acknowledge and deal with the uncertainty that brings as well. I guess the other one to consider is the value and the burden that we might get. So we might get a really high amount of value out of whether we want to take some blood, or we might take some muscle biopsies, which we get some really valuable information out of that. But the burden of doing all that would be highly time consuming, high amount of process involved to get and develop that data and that information, and then we might not even be able to act on it. So I think just some really being able to nail down what your purpose is, how valuable you think certain information is going to be, how easy it is to collect it, and also be able to act on it. Because at the end of the day, if you can't act on the information, then it's not really worth having as well.
And when you're, I guess now's a good example, because you're at a new club, like when you're in that stage of learning how things have been done in the past, and then in the phase of potentially bringing in some new things. What's your process in terms of leaning on staff members? Is it a high volume scenario where you're trying to get perspective from each different department, or is it more just less is more type approach, and building those relationships with a few key stakeholders in your department? Sort of take us through that process.
I think it's good to get a broad perspective of what everyone's like, coaching, even management, and also S&C, physiotherapy. I think it's good to get a broad spectrum of everyone's thoughts and opinions. But I think definitely any change that I would want to make, or any new things that I'd want to implement, I think need to be gradual over time. So usually you come in and you might have, like, my role at the club's a new role. So there's a couple of new things to implement. I think for me, the first thing is to nail those first. And also at the same time, listening to other people that you work with, S&Cs, physios, like I mentioned, and sort of having an ear out for what sort of problems they might have in their area, and then potentially how you think sports science might be able to help better inform those problems and be able to solve and create them as you go. But I definitely think it's definitely has to be a step-by-step approach. It can be really, I guess, easy to get stuck in the process of we've got 10 different things that we want to try and implement at one point. It's kind of like if you want to learn to juggle, you're going to start with juggle two balls, and then implement 3, and then implement 4. It definitely wants to sort of go along that process. But I'm a big believer in, I guess optimal performance, for lack of a better word, is definitely the product of everyone in the whole department: sports science, physiotherapy, S&C, like definitely coaches and players more than anyone. So I'm a big believer in sort of taking on the opinions and the thoughts and advice of everyone that's involved, and trying to collaborate with those people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned, being clear on your purpose, and knowing your values. How much has sort of your values as a sports scientist changed over the last sort of 10 years, and does it change a great deal from sport to sport? now that you've transitioned from, I guess, being in Cricket Australia, but then with specifically fast bowlers and then rugby league athletes and now AFL? How much do the values change, or how consistent are they, I guess?
No, I suppose my ultimate purpose and the main role I have is around monitoring and using that to implement, I guess, changes in the training program. And my purpose around that is, I think the number one purpose is to develop resilient athletes. So that for me, I've probably gotten, it hasn't changed over time, but I've probably become a lot stronger in that purpose over the years. I think when I first started in that particular space, the purpose in general in the industry was around, I mean, back in those days, we were sort of still going through a learning process. We're starting to be able, GPS was becoming embedded. We were being able to collect a lot of data, but we didn't necessarily know what all of it meant and how we could use it. And we've sort of been going on a journey of learning about that. And I think the purpose back in those days was a little bit more around trying to prevent injuries and probably predict, for lack of a better word, but try and, I guess, look for red flags and try and stop bad things from happening. Whereas, which I'd sort of refer to as more of a reactive sort of mindset. My purpose has definitely shifted a lot more to the proactive mindset, where I think if we can develop resilient athletes through good, solid training programs, then we can definitely prevent a lot of bad things in the injury sense from happening. So I wouldn't say that's changed too much over the years, but definitely that purpose of developing resilient athletes is something I've taken from sport to sport. And I guess the more I learn about particular areas, I guess the more you realize you don't know, but also the more I learn about particular areas, the more stronger I've sort of become in that mindset around developing resilience.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Did the penny drop one particular day in a particular sport where you thought, I'm a big believer in developing resilience? Resilient athletes is a key focus, a big pillar of how you go about your craft? Or is it something that, as you mentioned, it's sort of always been a strong belief, whether it came from maybe some mentors and then you've seen how effective it can be when it's done well, and then it's just got ingrained as it built on?
No, it's definitely something that was, I guess, first passed on to me from Tim and Peter that I mentioned at the start. That was always their belief and philosophy, which I think naturally you sort of gravitate to that when your mentors direct you in that way. But I've just seen plenty of evidence along the way that supports that. I suppose one of the work I mentioned in cricket a few times was one of the examples I had of that. But then I had another one of the other earlier projects that I was involved in. Rich Johnston was the lead author on it, but it was one of his PhD projects, and he looked at post-match fatigue responses in rugby league players, and he sort of looked at that relative to physical qualities. So one of his findings was that fitter players that performed better on a yo-yo IR1 test, those players had, as you'd imagine, they had higher workloads during matches, external and internal. So players with better physical qualities run more in matches than players with, I guess, less developed yo-yo IR1 ability. But I guess one of the key findings he had was that those particular players with better developed physical qualities, even though they had higher workloads, they had quicker recovery of post-match fatigue in the after 2 days post-match. So I think for me, in that sense, like a lot of the times when we're looking at workload data, we might sort of try and pick out players that we think have higher workloads and then try and, I guess, look to react to that and maybe those are the players that we need to, whether it's treat more or have interventions with more or maybe reduce training. And we think that those players are going to be the ones that are going to require that a bit more. But typically those players are the ones that potentially recover a bit faster, even despite the fact that they've had higher workloads. So I think for me, in terms of your question around when the penny dropped, that was probably when he produced those findings, that was probably where I became really, I guess, solidified in my stance that was sort of what I believed in.
Yeah. And how did he measure recovery from the game? I haven't seen that paper, but
I guess the one where he had the strongest findings was he looked at counter movement jump peak power. So pre-game, post-game, 24 hours post game, 48 hours post game, and I think he also took some blood measures and looked at creatine kinase concentration at those time points as well. Yeah, plus some
process.
Plus some subjective measures as well. So questionnaires, soreness questionnaires, and RPE, I believe.
Yeah. So the key takeaways from that is obviously developing their aerobic base and ability to condition the athletes, but then also not being reactive to just because they had a high output necessarily means they have to do less the following week. They're the ones that probably can continue working, and it's the ones that are
absolutely
not fit that you potentially need to look after and develop them.
Yeah, potentially. Definitely. Yeah, you summed up well there. And I think there's always outliers to that. It's not always necessarily a blanket case, but yeah, that's definitely, I think, solidifies that concept a bit.
Yeah. And on that topic, for the sports scientist or any staff member listening in, that's absolute gold. And Jem, I imagine people are probably searching for that paper now. But are there any other papers, or feel free to talk about your own work as well, where you've found that it's been quite practical in the approach and could be quite effective for practitioners listening in to apply to their trade?
Yeah. I guess one similar one in that grain that we had, it came out about 2020, but we looked at, we did some submaximal testing over a couple of years when I was at the Dragons, and Nathan Pickworth, who was the performance manager there, he's now at the Sharks, was involved in that as well. So we did a submaximal yo-yo, which is basically just the first 4 minutes of the yo-yo quite a number of times over 2 years. And we basically found that relative to their own individual, I guess, where we normally see them sort of sit, when players add higher training loads over a month, they typically tend to perform better at that submaximal performance test. So I think for me, that just sort of, I guess, acknowledges the important findings that, when you've had a good base of training over a monthly period, and we used to try and do that test after a period of rest, whether it was a couple of days off or whatever. So, you try and limit the influence of acute fatigue or anything like that. But that sort of solidifies the findings to me that, if you're having a good chronic period of training, you're typically well prepared to perform. But and I'm not saying everyone should go out and do a submaximal test regularly, because it can, I guess, present some other challenges in your program where you're adding time and extra workload and things like that. And that might be time that coaches want to spend on doing things. But there's also some other work in that space as well, where people have looked at small-sided games and things like that to try and measure people's internal response relative to a particular workload. I find things like that have been pretty valuable if you can get them within a program.
Yeah, okay. So the small-sided game has to, I imagine, be quite reliable in terms of dimensions and the amount of players in it.
Yeah. And usually when you start implementing things like that, it becomes a bit noisier. Like, there's a little bit more error in terms of the variability from game to game. And like you say, pitch size, area per player has to be the same. It has to be the same rules, same game. But usually you're looking. Pardon?
It'd be better for the athletes, I imagine. They'd do a submax test.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they get a bit more fun out of it. And there probably is a bit of I don't have any data or findings to support this, but I think there probably is a bit of a mental drain maybe to doing like the same submaximal shuttle-based test a lot. And there is something to be said about having a bit of fun within the program as well.
Yeah. So for you, now that you've seen both that have been quite effective, do you sort of is it case by case in terms of the environment that you're in and the staff that that you're working with, and you think, okay, I think this one could be quite effective? How do you go about sort of making an opinion on either one?
I definitely think it's a like I mentioned earlier, working and collaborating with other staff, I think in different areas is very important. So I definitely think it's a case by case basis in terms of what works in that particular environment. Sometimes coaches might have particular games that they like to have in there regularly, so you can sort of you might be able to slip in some monitoring in that sense without even having to change the program at all. Sometimes you might, if it's going to be something that's really going to be valued and acted on a lot, and use to make important decisions, you probably might need something that's a little bit more accurate and reliable and standardized, like a running test. So I definitely think it's a case-by-case basis, and whichever way you go, I think's fine, as long as you acknowledge the error that can be involved in doing it. So if it is something like small-sided games, you've got to acknowledge some of the challenges and the differences that you can have between those games, and you might not be able to act on it as reliably as something that's standardized.
Yep. And what type of metrics are you looking at for the small-sided games? And I guess another question with that is, like, are the athletes aware that small-sided game is also a monitoring tool, or are they not? Or is it you trying to keep it that they're not aware?
Well, for me, I think the measures I've used in that, particularly around the sub-maximal run test, that data was player load. So it's basically the accelerometers that they have in the GPS devices. And that'll just measure rate of change in acceleration in 3 different planes. So it's a little bit more difficult, I think, for players to understand than either meters that they cover or high-speed running meters, or whatever it might be. But it does capture a lot of different demands that are placed on them, so you can kind of get a little bit more of an overall picture of external workload. So for me, in those types of games, that'd probably be the first measure that I'd look at. But I suppose it's a good question, and if you are going to implement something like that, any type of sub-maximal test, it's probably worth assessing the individual changes or the responses to that test relative to a few different variables, and maybe finding out which one has the strongest relationship with some changes. So for me, in the examples I've used, it's been player load, but it might be in different sports or with different tests, it might be something different. But it's probably, like I mentioned before about taking a trip around the research process, it's probably worth validating and looking at the reliability of your own sort of tools while you're using them. In terms of the other part of your question around players knowing, I guess certainly when they're doing a sub-maximal run and test, they know that they're being assessed in some regard. But I think for me, most of the time with games, it's probably not so much letting them know beforehand. It's probably more just if you do need to use it as a conversation starter, maybe letting them know after the fact, hey, we've been doing these types of games or type of training, and we noticed this response, and then using it to try and couple it with some other information that you might have, or to generate a conversation with those players.
Yeah, it makes sense. And what's your sort of go-tos with the small-sided games? Is it player load again, or heart rate, or distance per minute? What are your sort of favourites?
I think from a performance point of view, Jace Delaney and Grant Duffy have done some good research around acceleration metrics and acceleration density. So that, for me, like, it's basically just average acceleration per second. I think for me is probably one of the ones that gets missed a little bit and not used so much. And I think that's probably a really important one. Meters, I guess meters per minute, I think is one to look at. It's typically, I think, a good variable because players and coaches understand what meters are, and they can have some ownership and some conversation around the conversation when they're and they can feel involved in it a bit more if they have an understanding of what the metric is. But definitely trying to couple that with maybe some variables that are a little bit more sport specific. But in terms of the internal response, I think for those particular types of tests, heart rate's the way to go. But heart rate can have some challenges for me, in my experience, for looking at total response to a training session, particularly in contact sports. They can get broken or ripped off or moved into poor positions where you're getting poor quality data. So I'm a big, I value like questionnaires, particularly rating and perceived exertion questionnaires post-training, which I think typically when players and athletes start using them, I think there's a little bit of a journey they go on where they start to sort of compare previous sessions that they've rated before and develop a bit of understanding around that info. But I think you can really develop some, if you can standardize things relative to each player, you can develop some good insights around what sort of responses you'd expect to see from a typical training session, that what sort of response you're getting today compared to what sort of response you'd expect to see from previous sessions. I think that's definitely one way to go if you can't implement any particular standardized games or standardized tests. that's certainly something I've valued in the past.
Yep. And when providing information, now that we're at the pointy end of pre-season, but what are some of your sort of key metrics, whether it be in rugby or in AFL, for developing resilient athletes? Is there sort of non-negotiable target that you have for individual athletes? And talk us through the data you sort of reference, whether it be their games that they play, position they play.
Yeah, good question. I think the two things are obviously volume and intensity. I think volume's usually the thing that's done a bit easier and really well. Like we can go out there and, we want to do a 12, 13, 14K session, and we can, we're wearing GPS units, so we know when that's going to happen. Probably the little bit more challenging thing around that regard is getting it in a certain amount of time or with a particular intensity. And that can definitely be, it's difficult to replicate training intensity maybe when you've got your, I guess, first team versus second team, comparing to the intensity that you might get when you've got, you're playing in a prelim final or a semi-final. Like that intensity is obviously going to be a bit higher, and that can be harder to replicate. But I think definitely a good ballpark. I know I referenced Jace Delaney and Grant Duthie before. They've done a lot of work around the peak periods and intensities in matches, whether it be 1 to 10 minute peak period. So I think, if you're having a 4 or 5 minute conditioning drill or conditioning small-sided game, whatever it might be, you want to be making sure that it's hitting the intensity that would be a fast intensity that we'd see in a peak 4 or 5 minute of a game. I think things like that are definitely good reference points. And in terms of the variables, I think it's always important, going back to from a volume point of view, I think it's always good to have three to 5 key variables and then maybe some supplementary variables after that. So I think distance is an important one. It's not the best, like I mentioned before, it's not the best workload measure, but I think in terms of creating player engagement, coach engagement, it's easy when those stakeholders have an understanding of what that is. So I think that's one that I use. I think the acceleration density or acceleration load is an important one. So we know we can cover 5Ks sort of running around the oval, but a lot of the demands of the game can be shuttle or change of direction based. And then a high-speed running measure as well, which I don't think high-speed running is typically not really related with training load per se. It's not necessarily a load measure, but it's definitely a performance metric. I think that's important for AFL players in particular to be prepared for. So those are probably the 3 starting points that I'd have. And then you obviously want to have some things that will supplement that, like top speed and relative max velocity.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks for providing such great detail in that. And in terms of a sports scientist, maybe someone who's going into either a semi-professional club for the first time as a sports scientist, or someone's going into an elite sport for the first time, where do you think you can make your biggest impact if you're thinking you're going to be at that club for a few years? And as you mentioned, it can be gradual, and that's probably the way to go in terms of building your relationships, but also not changing too much too quickly. But where do you think you can make your biggest impact as a sports scientist?
Good question. I guess the common answer is, we want the goal is to achieve optimal performance, but then that brings another question about, so how do you go about doing that, or what is optimal? But I think as a starting point, the things I just mentioned around training standards. So I think if you can set some objective criteria even before you start, say, the first training session of the preseason, but be able to set out some goals and some standards around what you think training should look like before you've even started. And I mentioned some there around peak periods of the games and what training intensity should be like. We want to prepare players for the volume that they're going to have on game day and the weeks that they're going to have in season. But I think, I suppose going back to when I started at South Sydney, one of the best things that I've had to do, which I hadn't had to do before, was get up in front of the coaches and the other staff and basically present on, what I thought training should look like. Some of the things I valued and believed in around what training should look like, how I was going to monitor them, how we were going to act on them, how I thought we could collaborate around certain things. And I think it really helps when you start somewhere from the beginning to be able to do that at the start. Not saying you can't change things or develop things along the way, but it makes those conversations easier when maybe 2, 3, 4 months in, if you want to bring something up that you think needs to be improved, you can sort of reference, hey, I brought up earlier on that this is something that I believe in. This is how it's going. Maybe this is something we could tweak or change. And it probably becomes a little bit easier to start that conversation. Or on the other guard, coaches might come up into you and sort of, how are those things going that you mentioned that we needed to be monitoring and acting on? So that's probably one thing from the start, where I think anyone coming into a new environment can probably try and make a difference. I think another thing that probably maybe gets forgotten about a little bit is I think people in the sports science role can probably provide a little bit of belief for players and coaches around the program as well. And, belief's a really powerful thing that I think, there's a bit of work around placebo effects and things like that. People just having belief in a particular thing that they're going in the right direction, but being able to show players and coaches that their program's going to prepare them for the hardest parts of the game or the hardest parts of, an in-season competition period or whatever it might be, I think helps them know that they're better prepared to attack what's ahead of them.
Yeah. So like a visual sort of tool, like a graph or something like that for the athletes to look at, or?
Yeah, I think it could be done in that way. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is what some of the hardest parts of the game are. This is where you're training or whatever it might be. I think obviously there's periods or times where you have to highlight things that maybe you think need to be improved, but maybe not trying to. It can become sort of, I guess,
a negative spin on it. And the athletes.
Yeah. Typically in sports science. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And sometimes when you're in that sports science role, when you start off, it might be easier to just sort of sit back and watch, and then you just see negative things that pop up that you think might want to be changed, and you only bring those things up, and it becomes a bit of a like, oh, who's this guy that just keeps telling us we need to change things? I think being able to just sort of, even though you might not need to do it, but just say, hey, I think we're going really well in this area, or hey, you're doing really good at this, I think really just creates a bit of energy and belief and positive feedback for everyone as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I picked up on what you mentioned before in terms of that collaborative approach and how you can help other stakeholders from the medical team, coaching team, athletes, and the high performance team. So briefly, what would be some things that you would do for those different areas, whether it be coaches with planning, training, athletes, the medical team, and of course, we've probably talked about the performance team a fair bit already, but those other key stakeholders, what would be some things that you'd be providing them with? Talk us through that for those that aren't aware.
Yeah. I think similar to what we mentioned before, you have to go through a process of finding out what coaches want training to look like. So I guess without going into too much, but coaches might have particular themes for a certain day where they want training to look, the movements or the demands of training to look in a certain way, and you might be able to whether loosely or strongly measure that in a certain way, but being able to provide them with that feedback. I know you mentioned, the coach mentioned, this was the intensity of this session was really good on this particular day. So you might be able to say, well, this was what I noticed that measured that. And then you can sort of keep tabs on that in previous days. If things tend to drop off or change, you've already sort of created that starting point and reference point to go back to. I think in terms of players, it's kind of, again, learning about what each individual player values and doesn't value. Some players probably don't care about GPS or they don't really want to know too much about it. They just want to carry on with whatever it is they need to do to train, which is fine. So you don't want to over bombard those players with too much info, and then other players just want to know sort of every little detail about everything. So it's been able to quickly give them a good snapshot about how they're going or where they're at. But I definitely, similar to a process of finding out what different people value or want to see out of certain things and what sort of feedback they want, and being able to get that to them quickly and efficiently where possible. And then the medical side of things, I think probably I mentioned earlier about just keeping an ear out for problems I think that people might have, or little, it's always good to get a bit of a two-way feedback from the medical department. The best sort of physios I've worked with can work really collaboratively around, you're giving them information about particular changes that you might see in players' programs, but they're also feeding that back with how players are responding or handling training as well. And that really helps, I think, develop a collaborative approach.
Yep. And from your sort of principles point of view, and then being malleable with your rules, do you want to give us a elaborate on that topic from a sports scientist point of view?
Yeah. Well, I think, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of research projects in sport have been observational in design. So I guess in the opposite to like a medical setting where we might, medical science might do a particular study where we look at the effect of X dose of a drug on, patient outcomes. And we have some definitive answers, like take 10 milligrams of this drug and you'll have this response. In sports science, we don't really have, they're pretty a lot of our findings can be pretty loose. We might read one study that tells us we can go in one direction and another one might contradict that. So I think you've got to be certainly, there's no clear, and I've made the mistake before in some research papers where I've spoken about thresholds that we can create to, make cutoff points for where we should put training. When training reaches X point, it could become an injury risk, but really that point could vary somewhere from here to, right up and down here. So I think you have to be a little bit sort of, like I'm saying, developing resilient athletes and training above the intensity of matches and preparing players for weeks that they might see in season are important, but what those actually are and what those points are, there's no clear definitive point that we need to get them to. So we might say we want to get them to 120% of what their biggest in-season week is, but if they only get to 115%, I don't think that means we've failed. It's just we're in the ballpark.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And before we start to wrap it up, mate, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think's important for either practitioners or even from an athlete's perspective when it comes to applying sports science in elite sport?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered a bit there. I can't really think of anything that I thought should be covered that we haven't really covered. I guess just for anyone in the sports science area, I guess the key point that we sort of mentioned there, which touched on it quite a bit, is just being collaborative and multidisciplinary in the whole department. And it's sort of the main role I see it from a sports scientist is you're there to support players and coaches, but also the other physiotherapy and S&C staff as well. So certainly I think collaborating with them and creating good relationships with all of those people, players and coaches included, is probably one of the most important things.
Yeah, 100%. It's a great takeaway and key message. Definitely something I noted down, and no doubt listeners did too. Before the last couple of questions, mate, for anyone that's got some follow-up questions for you, where's the best place to get in contact?
Probably LinkedIn's probably the best one. If you jump on there, I've got a Twitter account as well. I maybe don't monitor that one as much as I should, but if you jump on LinkedIn, that'd probably be the best place. Yeah, sure.
And what about in your work life, mate? Any pet peeves? Anything that fires you up?
Probably got a few. We're probably gonna run out of time. No, I don't really. I think for me in my space, people that use data for the purpose of just confirming their own opinions and then essentially just disregard it if it totally contradicts their own opinion. So I think in my particular space, you have to be very open-minded, and I've sort of mentioned that quite a bit. You have to be open-minded and ready to be challenged, and not just sort of trying to use data or information to confirm your own beliefs. So that's probably one of my pet peeves that bothers me.
Yeah, I can imagine that could be a challenging situation to be in when you find the data reveals something different to what you thought it originally would. What about your favourite way to spend a day off, mate?
The best day I've had off in a long time was about a week ago, and I took my daughter to swimming lessons. And then my 3-year-old daughter, Sophia, I took her to some swimming lessons, and we went to a park for about an hour and a half. She played around there. We went out to lunch. I got a good coffee. She got a good ice cream. Went home, had a nap, and then I took her to this place called Rainbow Town that had like ball pits and slides and dodgem cars and trampolines, and I probably had more fun there than she did. But anything where anything where I'm spending time with my family, is probably how I like to spend my day off. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome, mate. And what about, it's obviously a big year ahead, and we're early, recording this in February of 2023, but what's on the horizon for you, not just professionally, it can be personally as well, mate, that you're excited about for 2023?
Yeah. Professionally, well, like I said, I'm in a new sport, so I'm really looking forward to some games starting. I think in any year around February, everyone gets a bit drained at the end of preseason. It's pretty keen for some games, but particularly for me this year, like being in a new sport, getting to go to the MCG a fair bit, packed MCG. I'm really looking forward to that and looking forward to singing the team song a lot. And then fingers crossed, and then hopefully, and personally, looking forward to baby number 2 showing up in April.
Yeah, massive. Congratulations again. That's
Thanks,
awesome.
mate. Appreciate it.
Yeah, huge year. And thank you so much for jumping on the show and sharing with us your experiences across a few different sports there. It's absolutely fascinating on both discussing performance metrics for team success, but also injury mitigation, and then the behind the scenes, what it's really like to be a sports scientist in it, working collaboratively with all the key stakeholders. So thoroughly appreciate it, mate. And like you mentioned, Twitter or LinkedIn's the best place for anyone to get in contact. So I'll add those in the show notes for anyone that's listening to the podcast recording. If you're tuned in with us, thank you for tuning into the live chat. If you listened in halfway through, make sure to watch the rest of the episode. They'll be on YouTube, and we'll post it on our podcast the next couple of weeks. But thanks again, Billy.
No worries. Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me ramble on.
Awesome, mate. And all the best. We'll have to catch you around Abbey Park at some point and grab a coffee. And thanks again for anyone that's tuned in. Our next chat is with Steve Saunders. They'll be talking about the performance and medical team, how they can work collaboratively in team sport success. So he worked at Geelong Cats last year, so we'll be talking about their obviously winning the premiership. So that'll be 4:00 next Thursday. So I'll see you guys then.